words, he blew into his nostrils a breath of life, and so man became a living soul. We discussed the various interpretations, if I remember correctly. And now we're going to begin with the story of continuation of chapter 2, which is more of a detailed description of the creation of Adam and Eve and giving us some background. So now we begin to discuss the Garden of Eden, even though the story of the Garden of Eden, of the plot, does not begin until chapter 3. But chapter 2 is sort of giving us the background of where God placed Adam and Eve, and therefore we talk about the Garden of Eden. So that's verse 8, and there are a few verses here about the Garden of Eden, and also some detail about where exactly the garden is, about the river that flows through the Garden of Eden, and how that river flows out to 4 different directions, flows and becomes 4 different rivers. So we have a lot about the geography and the topography of the Garden of Eden. And then we go back to the story of creation of man and woman, because again, we're getting more specific in chapter 2. So I think it's just going to be easier if we don't really discuss the concept of the tree of knowledge yet. Maybe we'll wait till we get to chapter 3, and we'll talk about the tree of knowledge and the meaning of the tree of knowledge and why Hashem commanded him not to eat of the tree of knowledge. We'll put that all together in chapter 3. So for now, we'll skip over that and discuss the gardens, discuss the rivers, discuss naming the animals, discuss the creation of Eve. So we have a lot of work to do before we get to the Garden of Eden. So I hope that's okay. So that's verse 8. Hashem Elohim planted a garden in Eden to the east, and there he placed the man he had formed. So we know that there's a place in the east called Eden. Now, what does Eden mean? So Eden could be a name of a place, but Eden comes from the word Eden, which is also pleasure. So something about that garden is pleasurable. So we know that the luxury today, you want pleasure, you want to eat something pleasurable. I don't know what people do, but in nature, pleasurable food is fruit. Right, the fruit is the pleasure. The fruit is not the staple, and maybe the vegetable is the staple, or the root, or the grain, but the fruit is pleasure. So the concept of gan, the concept of garden in the Torah is a place for pleasure, and fruit trees are also for pleasure. And that's the name of the place. Eden also means pleasure. So God planted a garden of pleasure to the east, and there he placed man, which he had formed. Later, the verse is going to tell us that Hashem took Adam and placed him in the garden, meaning to say Adam was not created in the garden, Adam was placed in the garden. And why is that? Why couldn't God just create him in the garden? So some of the commentators explain that this is really a kindness to Adam. The kindness is that Adam should recognize the world outside the garden and then appreciate the fact that he is in a garden, he's in a state of pleasure. The problem with the human being, we've been suffering for this problem for more than 6,000, we're suffering for this problem for almost 6,000 years, is that people don't necessarily appreciate what they have. And it's a challenge to be able to appreciate what we have. If you have something new, something exciting, okay, the pleasure lasts for a day, for 2 days, for a month, for half a year, whatever it may be, but ultimately it's a challenge to recognize how we are blessed. And one of the ways of doing that is realizing that, not taking it for granted. So in order that Adam should not take the garden for granted, later the verse says that God placed Adam in the garden, but he wasn't created in the garden, because God doesn't want Adam to be created into a state of pleasure, because then the pleasure is not appreciated and therefore not felt. So that's a detail that we get later. Verse 9, Hashem Elohim made grow out of the soil every tree that is pleasant to look at and good for producing food, and the tree of life in the middle of the garden, and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. So we know that there's many trees, including the tree of life and the tree of knowledge. So we'll get back to that. Like I said, the end when we get to chapter 3, we'll talk about the tree of life and the tree of knowledge and what the meaning of that is. But for now, we'll continue. So now the Torah tells us a little bit more about the surroundings of the garden and the environment of the garden. So there is a river, verse 10. A river went out of Eden to water the garden. And from there it separated and became 4 headwaters. And now we have 4 headwaters. Now we have the name of 4 different headwaters, or 4 different rivers. And they're named from verse 11 all the way till verse 14. So we'll just read them to get a feel. It talks about the regions through which those rivers flow and the characteristics of those rivers. The name of the first is Pishon, which surrounds the land of the Chavila, where there is gold. So if you want gold, find the Pishon River and follow the trek along the river, and you'll get to some gold. The gold of that land is good. Also found there is Bedolach, Bedilium, and Even HaShoham, Anyak stones. No idea what these are. 2 names of brilliant stones that are actually mentioned later in the Torah with the stones of the high priests. In any case, that's the first river. The second river is Gihon. It surrounds all the land of Cush. The name of the third river is Chidekel, which flows to the east of Ashur. The fourth river is Paras. So we have 4 rivers, and the verse seems to imply that the river flows forth from Eden to water the garden, and then when it flows out of the garden, it becomes 4 heads. So that's beautiful. Now we know there must have been a lot of water there, and of course, if you have a tree garden and you want pleasure, you don't have to work hard to plant, to feed the water. The land with a lot of water is fertile, and that's why you have a beautiful garden and a beautiful tree, and everything seems very nice and very wholesome and very pleasurable. Okay, what's really happening here? The first problem is, do we have 1 river flowing into 4 rivers in the Middle East? So in other words, do these rivers exist? That's the first problem.
Rabbi,
yeah.
But it's known that rivers shift. I mean, rivers are not a permanent thing. They alter with the configuration of the land, which changes. So that may not be
correct. But if you're talking about a large river, a river like the Nile, it's been here. We know of it for thousands of years.
Yes, but it's
right?
but they also say that they've solved issues because they see that the path of the Nile has shifted, at least its tributaries.
Right. Okay, so let's think of that. So some people are looking to find the 1 river that flows into 4, and that becomes a little bit difficult. So let's assume we can try to trace where these rivers are. So verse 13, the name of the second river is Gihon. It surrounds the land of Cush. Cush, what's Cush? Cush is Ethiopia. Okay, so Africa. The first one is Pishon. Rashi says Pishon is the Nile. The word Pishon means increase, and the Nile increases, right? That's how the Egyptians would grow their agriculture. They would have canals from the river, and the river would overflow and flow into the canals and water the produce. So Rashi says the first one is Nile. Second one is somewhere in Ethiopia, somewhere in Africa. The third is Chidekel, which goes to Ashur. So that is not in Africa. That is in the Middle East. That is in Assyria. So that's next to, I guess close to Babylonia. That could be in Iraq. And the fourth is the Prat. So people would think that number 3 would be the Tigris and number 4 would be the Euphrates. So these are the 4 major rivers in the Middle East or in the Near East that were known then and are known today. The problem with that interpretation is that they don't really flow from the same place. So you have 2 in Africa. So you can have the Nile. Some people say it's 2 branches of the Nile, the Blue Nile, the White Nile. Fine, okay, I can deal with 2. And then you have the Euphrates and the Tigris, but also they're in a different geography and they don't seem to flow from the same river. So that's just people trying to figure out what exactly that this means. And there are different theories. Jill says that rivers shift. Other commentators, more modern commentators, say that the verse says they became 4 headwaters, Arba Rashim, 4 heads, right? In verse 10, a river went out of Eden to water the garden, and from there it separated and became 4 headwaters. So what is headwaters? What does head mean? Now, typically when you read that one river flows into 4, you would expect the word to be not head, each one is a head, but to the contrary, each one should be a branch, right? You have the root and you have a branch. You say it branches out, the river branches out from the main headway. But here it says, no, it doesn't say that there are 4 branches branching out. It says that this river, the one river of Eden, becomes 4 headways, meaning not that they're branches, they are not necessarily connected, but somehow or another, their source comes from one place of water. And therefore, some people say what can happen is the water can flow, and then the water seeps into the earth, and it can appear somewhere else in the earth as a separate headway, not a separate branch, a separate headway. So that's just one other way of thinking about these rivers, that it doesn't necessarily mean that they literally come from one and flow into 4. Because if that was the meaning, then you would say not 4 heads, but you would say 4 branches, right? The head seems to be saying each one is a head for itself, each one is a source of itself. So that's just if you want to try the geography. Other people looked for the 4, and because they couldn't find 4 flowing from 1, they said maybe some of the rivers dried up. Again, whatever you want to say, whatever interpretation you like, enjoy it. I'm just trying to give you some of the options. Go ahead, Jill.
Okay.
Rabbi?
I wonder, okay. Beth, go ahead.
No, yeah, I was just going to say, in terms of, we know in terms of modern times how Saddam Hussein managed to disrupt the water supply to punish dissidents, right? So
right.
We know that if we assume it's in the Fertile Crescent, which to
Yes.
me makes a lot of sense to say, it was dubbed the Fertile Crescent for a reason. It makes sense to me that geographically, it just makes sense. And the fact that, water supplies could be rerouted, disrupted. He did it with dams and whatever else he used to disrupt the water supply, but we know that was the case. So
Correct. You could move water to some degree. Moving rivers start wars. The real reason, according to some opinions, for the 6-day war was the Syrians were trying to divert the waters that flow into the Jordan River, and that really was the real underlying cause of the war. So yes, people try to move rivers, but again, for a long time, people know of these regions, and they see it was all part of the Fertile Crescent. You're right, but it's clear that Kush, Ethiopia, is not next to Ashur. It's not next to Assyria. So you're right. Maybe someone diverted the river. Maybe the river dried out. These are 2 options. Another option is, again, more modern interpretation, is that the verse never says they flow from one. They flow from one source. It doesn't say that the one river branches out. One river branches out means they are physically connected. But if you say there's one river, and then you say that this river becomes 4 heads, a head is a beginning, meaning there's 4 different beginnings to this river. Somehow or another, there's this source of water, and the source of water underground separates into 4 things. And again, this may or may not be the interpretation you like, but I'm going to give the spiritual interpretation. And according to the spiritual interpretation, it lines up perfectly. but it could also mean the simple interpretation. It's important to understand that this subtlety, it doesn't say 4 branches, it says 4 heads. May or may not be significant. Go ahead, Jill.
It sounds like it's in different worlds. Like the original thing was in Berea, or in the higher worlds, and the
Okay, so you want to say this is figurative. Okay.
Yeah.
Why
The
is it figurative?
source was one, and it was created in the world of material things as 4 headwaters.
Okay, so you're saying there's one source of water, spiritual source of water, and down here the spiritual source of water comes appears as 4 heads, 4 beginnings, 4 heads, 4 beginnings, and 4 different regions, 4 different major rivers. Okay, I'm going to say what you're saying a little. Hopefully, I'll be able to add a little salt and pepper, but essentially, you're in the right direction. Yes, or I'm gonna be following you, so I'm in good company. Okay, so I'm going to give a little interpretation here. It's from the Malbim. Very interesting interpretation. He's from the 19th century, and he was a fascinating individual. He wrote a commentary on the Torah and on as well as the Nach, the prophets and the writings. And he takes a lot from the Hasidic writings, and he's very interesting. He's very creative. So he says as follows, and again, some of what he says is written earlier, but I've not seen it written out as beautifully as the way he puts it. So if you think about it, what is a river? What do we think of a river? We think of a river, I don't know, why do you go on a river? Today you go on a river, you go for pleasure, you want to go fly fishing, you go to the river. What is a river? But in essence, if you lived in the ancient world, a river is a highway. A river is a way you travel. Right? You wanted to travel across the United States and what do they call it? You want to scout the land. They follow the trail. What trail do they follow? Correct me if I'm wrong. They follow the rivers, right? They follow what do they follow? The Mississippi, then to the Missouri. Correct me if I'm wrong. I don't remember. But that's the way you travel. People travel along rivers because they have close to water, and then that's the highway. They can always trace their way backward. So if you say this Eden, there's one river, and then eventually there are 4 highways. What you're telling me is that people, Adam and Eve, begin in Eden, but then there's 4 rivers, but 4 rivers means 4 pathways where people can leave Eden. Now, it doesn't mean literally, they're not all in Eden together, but there's 4 ways you can separate from Eden. Now, what is Eden? So I said Eden, the word Eden means pleasure. So if you're in the Garden of Eden, you have pleasure. What kind of pleasure is in the Garden of Eden? So you have also fruit. Fruit is good. There's nothing wrong with having good fruit. But fruit is just to entertain the body. Spiritually speaking, there is spiritual pleasure, spiritual bliss in the Garden of Eden. And what is the spiritual bliss in the Garden of Eden? So it says that there's one river in Eden. It doesn't say one, but it says there's a river in Eden to water the garden. Umisham yipared. From the Garden of Eden, it separates, which means before the separation, there's oneness. Okay, so what's the pleasure? What's the Eden? What's the pleasure in the Garden of Eden? The pleasure is the oneness. Before there's separation, before there is fragmentation. Now you know enough to know that when the Torah says oneness or alludes to oneness, what does oneness mean? Oneness means the oneness of God. And if you're living and you feel that the oneness of God is embracing you and is everywhere around you, and everything you see is an expression of the oneness of God, that is a spiritual bliss, that's spiritual pleasure, right? What is our idea of Gan Eden, of paradise? Gan Eden literally means the Garden of Eden. So Adam and Eve lived in the Garden of Eden, but we call the place of where the soul goes, in other words, the state of mind where the soul goes after the passing to receive reward. What's our idea of reward? So we know what other religions think. Other religions are more exciting. They say you got 70 virgins. We're not as exciting. We say you get Garden of Eden. What's Garden of Eden? Garden of Eden is pleasure. What's pleasure? Pleasure means pleasure and awareness of Hashem, awareness of God. Pleasure from understanding. And because God is infinite, the pleasure that you can derive from understanding the essence of God is infinite. And therefore, people, that's the reward. The reward is the spiritual pleasure of the knowledge, of the awareness of God. Now, I can't say I understand it. Maimonides writes that you can't explain to physical people the spiritual pleasure of paradise, of Gan Eden. He says a very interesting metaphor. He says, just like you cannot explain to a blind person the difference between colors. If somebody was blind from birth, Try to explain the difference between blue and green. Go ahead. Take it away. It's impossible because the person doesn't have the tools to understand what you're talking about. And Maimonides says that's the metaphor of we cannot understand what does it mean to have spiritual bliss and spiritual pleasure of understanding the oneness of God. But we assume that that's the case. In other words, we assume that if eating cotton candy is pleasurable and understanding an idea is pleasurable, then to understand, the higher you go with understanding, the more pleasure you would get. And we know that there is, in this world, people can refine their forms of pleasure. What's more pleasurable, food or understanding or wisdom or philosophy? So, of course, food is easier. Every kid likes sugar because it's a lower form of pleasure. But to receive the higher forms of pleasure takes effort. You have to develop a taste for wisdom. And you have to develop a taste for things that are more abstract. But once you do develop those tastes, then the pleasure you get from wisdom is actually much greater than the pleasure you would get from something more physical. And how do I know? Because that's the way it is. In the physical realm, the more you have something, the less you want it. Right? The second bite of chocolate is not as tasty as the first bite of chocolate. I have that at home. Someone gave us the book of, they call it the Food Rules. I forgot the person who wrote it. I think Pollock, I forget his name. It was a New York Times bestseller. And they have something like 50 food rules and a lot of interesting food rules. And the idea is, one of the rules that I like the best is, some rules are like, don't buy your food where your car gets gas. It's like rules, just, simple rules. So one rule is, don't forget that the banquet is in the first bite. In other words, we're physical people. The first bite tastes the best. The second bite doesn't taste as good as the first bite because you already had it. It's not as exciting. So my problem is that when I taste the second bite and I realize that it's not as good as the first bite, then I take a third bite because I hope the third bite will be more like the first bite. And then I eat the third one. The third one is even less enjoyable than the second. So now I want the fourth because maybe the fourth will get me back to the first. Before you know it, I finished the cake. But that's the problem with physical. The physical things, the more I had of the first bite of chocolate is tastier than the second. And therefore, you give me more and more chocolate, eventually I get sick of it. With wisdom, or any more spiritual pleasure, music, the more you have it, the more you want. And that awakens the pleasure for that same thing. So it's a different form of pleasure. Okay, so I went off topic. What am I saying? I'm saying the oneness. When you say that there's a river that flows through Eden, Eden is pleasure, flows from Eden, from pleasure. The source of all pleasure is one river. It doesn't say the word one, but it says then after the Garden of Eden, Yiparade, it separates, it fragments. Okay, so in Eden, there's one pleasure. Now there are four highways. Once you leave Eden, in other words, once you leave physical, spiritual pleasure, now there are four highways. There are four ways that people travel to find pleasure. Okay, what are the four ways? Well, let's go through. First of them is gold. People want money. That's what it says. Verse 11. The name of the first is Pishon, which surrounds all the land of Chavila, where there is gold. Not only gold. The gold of that land is good. They have bedolach, which is types of crystal. Even hashoam, they have precious stones. So people are running. So people leave the spiritual pleasure, and there's four highways. Remember, a river is a highway. And there are four ways where people travel to attain pleasure. First one is gold. First one is money. That's the possessions. That's one category, head category, that people seek pleasure from. The second, he says, the name of the second river is Gihon, which surrounds all the land of Cush. So the Malbim tells me that Cush is a place, it's beneath the equator, it's very hot. And hot represents physical passion, especially sexual passion. That's the second place where people look for pleasure. What's the third place? The third place, people want honor and power. So he quotes the third river is Chidekel, which flows to the east of Ashur, the first kingdom of the world, the first kingdom in the sense, the first kingdom that sought to expand. In other words, I'm not talking about a kingdom. What's the word I'm looking for? There's a word I'm looking for. I don't think it's kingdom, but the fact that the king wants to expand and take over the world. So that's Assyria. Assyria was the first one to conquer, the first country to conquer the entire known world. So where does that come from? Because the people of Assyria had a sense of pride, and they wanted honor, and they wanted power, and they wanted to extend their power. That's the third place where people seek wisdom. And the fourth river, he says, is Prat. And Prat is the Euphrates, and the Euphrates, in some definitions, Euphrates is the border of Israel, because God promised Abraham not just this land, the land of the seven nations, which is the Israel that we received up till this point, but God ultimately promised Abraham the land of 10 nations from the river of Egypt to the Euphrates, and that's the border. So in other words, that's the farthest border of Israel when Israel will expand, and the Euphrates is therefore called the river closest to Israel. It's the border of Israel, and therefore, says the Malbim, that represents the most spiritual pleasure, and that is the pleasure of wisdom. And therefore, if you reread these verses now, it's not just geography, it is also geography, because the geography affects the culture, affects the people and where they live. If you live in certain areas, that even the topography develops the culture and develops what people value. And if you live in a place of gold, you like gold. If you live in a place that the culture honors honor and power, then that's what you seek. If you live in a place of wisdom and that's what they value, then you want to get a PhD. Every culture values certain things, and it's tied into the geography and the topography of the land. But according to this reading, this is beautiful, because we have Eden, we have the spiritual state of spiritual pleasure, where you're connected to the oneness, and that's the state of Adam and Eve. That's the state of the Garden of Eden. And now we're talking about a story. Understand that pleasure evolves. Pleasure is not going to stay the way it was in the Garden of Eden. And a person has the choice of which form of pleasure, which highway they want to follow. In your life, you're following a certain highway depending on what you're pursuing. And either you're in the Garden of Eden, where there you would pursue and appreciate the pleasure, the spiritual bliss of connecting to God. But people separate and diverge from that. Adam and Eve themselves diverged from that. They didn't want to stay in the place of paradise. They wanted to experiment with other forms of pleasure. And that is, according to the Malbim, and others, but the Malbim spells it out nicely, the interpretation of this verse. There's Eden, there's pleasure, there's the oneness that flows through Eden, and that's the garden where you have spiritual bliss, pleasure of connecting to God. But people, then there's the potential. When God created the pleasure, God created the potential of the pleasure to separate into different forms. And that's represented by the four different mass highways, rivers. It doesn't mean that they geographically come from the same place, but spiritually they come from the same place, because water represents the highway where people flow. Water also represents pleasure. Water gives forth creates things that are pleasurable. And therefore, the Torah is telling us, make no mistake, the world is a place where the oneness of the pleasure of God later could separate outside of Eden. It separates and it becomes four separate heads, because people will then have the choice to pursue different forms of pleasure. So I read that. When I read that, I thought that was absolutely beautiful, and another way of looking at the story.
Rabbi?
Yes.
In that interpretation, we kind of put on the same level the desire to have more wealth and desire for intellectual pursuits, and also kind of putting them way too high on a spiritual level. So why is do you think that's the problem with this interpretation? Is it addressed somewhere?
No, I think what the Malbim does is says he's not giving a hierarchy of what's higher. He's giving a hierarchy of what's popular. And he says the fourth one, it doesn't really talk a lot about the fourth one. And some people say the fourth one is actually the smallest of the rivers, even though other places the Torah refers to the Euphrates as Nahar HaGadol, the great river, the river of Prat, the river of Euphrates, but it's not the greatest, it's not the longest river. So the Talmud there says, the Medrash says, that it's called great only because it's close to Israel, but it's not really the greatest river. In other words, says the Malbim, of all the rivers, the least popular is wisdom. Okay? So we're not talking about what is a higher level spiritually. Spiritually, a higher level is Israel. In other words, the Euphrates, wisdom. But wisdom is not the most popular, right? People want different things. People want money. Not everybody wants to. You want money. People want pleasure, sexual pleasure. Not everybody wants to be the king who runs an entire kingdom, right? Not everybody wants honor in that way. But money, physical possessions, is something everyone understands. Second one, the heat, the passion, people understand that. Then there's the fourth one doesn't even get a mention, doesn't really discuss anything about it. It's because don't bother talking about it. You know why? There's no one there. There's no one really pursuing wisdom.
That's fascinating because
Yeah.
the creation of independent consciousness starts with kind of defining what's the priority for this consciousness.
Correct. And going back to Jill's point that you're talking about the spiritual worlds, they refer to the one river that flows through Atzilut, the highest world, and Misham Yipared, separation. Separation is the point where you move from the oneness of God to separate consciousness. And that separate consciousness of pleasure takes different forms. And of those forms, wisdom is the last one. Nobody really cares about wisdom. See, in America, we like to think that we're into education. We're not. Why are we not into education? Because we don't see education as a value for itself. Why do you want your child, or why do you want a degree? So you can get a better job. Okay, so you want the money. You want the honor, you want the money, you want the power. You don't want education for itself. In other words, you're not looking for wisdom in its own sake. That's something that's not common. In Judaism, the concept becomes that there's Torah Lishma, there is wisdom for the study of Torah for its own sake. You're not studying necessarily Torah to make you a better person, although it may do that. You're not studying Torah to know what to do, although it may teach you what to do as well. But you're studying Torah for its own sake. You're studying wisdom to connect to the wisdom of God for its own sake. That is something that is not so common. And people in this country, I think in the West, they have trouble separating between their desire for education and really what they really mean is they want what the education could produce. But their desire for wisdom on its own sake, just to sit and philosophize, this is not something that's very common today, although in the past it was seen maybe a little bit more. I read a description, not going to do justice to it, but Rabbi Steinsaltz, who translated the Tanya, the Talmud and the Tanya, and wrote many books. He passed away on Friday. So last night I was reading an article about an interview with him by none other than Yair Lapid. Yair Lapid is the head of the opposition in Israel. If you know anything about Israeli politics, he's not very religious, to say the least, but he has this discussion about 10 years ago with Rabbi Steinsaltz, and he's trying to ask Rabbi Steinsaltz, what is an intellectual? What is somebody who seeks wisdom? And I don't remember, I read it about 11 o'clock at night last night, but he says we're sitting together, a group of people, and we're sitting 3 o'clock in the morning, and we're asking whether there's dogs go to heaven. And they had a whole debate for 3 hours whether dogs go to heaven. Of course, Rabbi Steinsaltz is trying to explain this to Yair Lapid. You have to know the people to appreciate it. So Yair Lapid can't figure it out. He's trying to, so he's describing the discussion and what the philosopher thinks and what this person thinks. And Yair Lapid is like, so is there at the end, is there dog heaven or is there no dog heaven? Rabbi Steinsaltz is like, you're missing the point. It doesn't really matter. What matters is the discussion. What matters is the quest. What matters is the analysis, right? For its own sake. We're not necessarily just sitting to discuss whether or not dogs go to heaven. What I'm trying to say is that the concept of wisdom as pleasure for its own sake, we think about wisdom because that is enjoyable. That is something that's the fourth river. And at least in the Malbim's times, he says that that's the least common trodden highway. I think that it's still not so common. I think the other highways are more busy. But that's for that.
Rabbi,
Yes.
you're referring to Rabbi Steinsaltz, who just passed away Friday?
Yes.
Yeah.
So I read the interview that was reproduced of the interview that he had with this gentleman about 10 years ago. But he was trying to pass over the scene that sitting together at 3 o'clock in the morning, talking and thinking for the sake of questioning, that is wisdom. That's a pleasure of wisdom. What is derived from it is secondary.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you. So,
Thank
but
you.
it still doesn't answer the question, how do all those, how they connect to this source, spiritual source for that independent consciousness?
In some sense, they're all pleasure. Remember, pleasure is what they all have in common. And they all stem from the same source. The same source is pleasure. The source of all pleasure is divine pleasure. And then it separates from the divine consciousness and it takes forms of created pleasure. Now, created pleasure, because we're in a world of separation and fragmentation, therefore the pleasure takes on a fragmented expression. And there's not one pleasure, but there are multiple pleasures. And the reason why you need multiple pleasures is because none of them are really going to satisfy you completely. As opposed to the one pleasure, the pleasure of oneness is the only wholesome one. But the wholesome one is the one pleasure. So just going into technicality for a moment, because Jill mentioned there are 3 spiritual worlds. According to the Kabbalah, there are 4 spiritual worlds. There's the world of Atzilut, where you feel the oneness of God, and then there's the 3 worlds of creation, formation, action. So I don't want to go into this right now because we'll go into it in a page or 2. We'll get into that in a minute. But there's 4 worlds. Now, according to the Kabbalah I alluded to earlier, the world number 1, Atzilut, where you feel the consciousness of God, there you just feel the oneness. There's no separation. Then you have Yipared, separation. And when you have separation, it becomes 4 rivers. But if you're following and you're a mathematician, you should ask 1 second, why are there 4 rivers? There should be 3 rivers, right? Because Atzilut is 1, there's one source. And then it divides into Bria, Yetzira, Asiya, formation, creation, and action, the 3 lower worlds. Why are there 4 rivers? So what some of the commentators explain, the 4th river is really the 1 river. In other words, there's 1 river and 3 branch out. In other words, 3 separate, but the 4 is you're really left with the first. In other words, of those 4 forms of pleasure, the way of that 1 form of pleasure, the way it is in Eden, the other ones branch out or separate. What still stays is the wisdom. In other words, the closest we can get to the pleasure of Eden is the wisdom, because the wisdom is the most spiritual. So one way to read it is you have oneness. You have a spiritual oneness, a pleasure of the spiritual oneness. That's an Atzilut, that's in the most spiritual world. Then it divides into 3. But then 3 branch out. It doesn't say the word branch out. 3 become 3 different heads. But there's really a 4th head. But the 4th head is really the first head. In other words, the 4th one is really the main one. In other words, the one that was originally 1 now becomes number 4. So it's really 3 branching out, but you're left with the 1. And therefore, the closest way to reconnect to the sense of spiritual bliss, we can't do it fully in this world, but the closest we can get to that is the Prat, is the Euphrates, is the wisdom. And through wisdom, we could elevate ourselves to the most spiritual plane that's possible on this earth.
Thank you, Rabbi. It's beautiful.
Thank you.
Rabbi?
Yes.
Are you saying that the original things that separated come together in the world of the material world? That's where they unite again in a more sort of a hidden form.
I'm not saying that. I'm saying in this world they're separate. They separate, they fragment. So verse 10 says, a river went out of the Eden to water the garden. And from there, meaning from the garden, outside the garden, it separates and becomes 4 separate heads. So in this world is fragmentation. In this world, there's different forms of pleasure. But in the spiritual world, there's 1 form of pleasure, because the pleasure, in other words, the highest world, the world of Atzilut, the Garden of Eden, the state of the Garden of Eden is you sense the oneness of God. And the oneness of God is all-encompassing. And because it's all-encompassing, you don't have fragmentation. And that's the real true pleasure. Pleasure really means when you go back to the place of oneness and of unity. I'll try to explain that. I'll try to explain this. Let me see if I can do this. It's very hard to define exactly what you mean, what you mean by pleasure. But one way is as follows. This may or may not do it for you. You may connect to this metaphor, you may not. Either way, I'm just putting it out here as a possible interpretation. In other words, where do you see that pleasure? That ultimately pleasure is oneness. So there's a difference between will and pleasure. Will is I want something. Why do I want something? Probably for pleasure, but maybe not. But in other words, will is separate from pleasure. According to the Kabbalah, Kabbalah explains the word ratzon for will represents running. I desire something. Something's outside of me. I want it. What does it really mean? It means my soul is pulling me to get to that object. So it's flowing outward. That's will. What is pleasure? Pleasure is the opposite. According to the Kabbalah, will is flowing inward. Pleasure is flowing inward. When I'm experiencing pleasure, my energy is coming back to myself, and ultimately that's the pleasure. So let me give you a scenario. I think I once discussed it, but it's good to think about again. It's interesting. Let's say I'm sitting on the Long Island Sound on my yacht, and somebody next to me, and I'm having a wonderful Sunday afternoon, even though they said it was partly cloudy today, partially cloudy. No, I think now it's sunny. So I'm sitting out a perfect day to be out on the Long Island Sound with my yacht. And I'm enjoying myself. I can't tell you how much. All of a sudden, sailing right next to me is a yacht twice the size. And all of a sudden, I thought I'm the king of the hill. I thought I'm the king of the sound. And now all of a sudden, I'm small compared to the guy next to me. I look at myself and I say, I really want that yacht. Okay. At that moment, I'm experiencing will. What does will mean? I want something outside myself. Now, what all forms of pleasure have in common is in the moment of pleasure, I don't want anything, I don't need anything, I'm not missing anything. That's the definition of pleasure. Okay, no matter what you get the pleasure from. But at this moment, I don't need anything. And think about this. This may or may not resonate, but think about this. It resonates to me. I think this is true. When you're having pleasure, if it's real pleasure, you're not missing anything. If you're in pain, you can't have pleasure. The opposite, the Sefer Yetzirah, the first book of the Kabbalah, writes the opposite of pleasure is pain. If you're experiencing pleasure, you're missing nothing. If I'm missing something, it's not pleasure. Then it's will. I feel I need something else. That's will. That's not pleasure. So what does it mean that I feel like I'm missing nothing? What it means is I'm returning to myself. I'm returning to my essence, which is oneness. And it's connected to God's oneness. In other words, with will, this fragmentation. I have some things, I don't have everything. I need more, I want less, I want different. That's fragmentation. If I touch the place of the essence of my soul, then I'm touching pleasure. If I touch that place, I don't need anything because I'm complete. Why am I complete? Because I'm connected to the oneness, to the infinite oneness of God. Now, sometimes what gives me pleasure is a piece of chocolate, or a cup of coffee, or a yacht, whatever it may be. But it's not that the chocolate does it for me. It's the chocolate helps me get to the place of my soul where I don't need anything. That's pleasure. And therefore, pleasure is ultimately, the true pleasure is oneness. In this world, more often than not, we're not experiencing, we experience true pleasure, but it's fleeting. Because we're in a world of separation, it's hard for us to maintain that pleasure. It's actually impossible for us to maintain that pleasure. And therefore, the pleasure is fleeting. And a minute later, I want something else. I want something more. I'm back to will. Because I can't connect to that infinity of self, that oneness, which is my essence. Because that essence is too spiritual for my consciousness. So I could touch it for a moment, but then I lose it. And then all of a sudden, I already want my fellow's yacht. But the point here is that when I'm in a state of true pleasure, then I'm like an Eden. And like an Eden, there's oneness, there's no fragmentation. Once I flow out of Eden, I separate from the spiritual pleasure. Now there's pleasure, but there's fragmentation. So this is just another way of thinking about it. May be helpful.
Rabbi?
Yes.
But when so given that, then you would think that once a person experienced Gan Eden, they would never be tempted to the frivolous things like gold and, all these other things. So
Right.
was it that Hashem sent them out and that's how we got lost in this? Because otherwise we should have no temptation to leave such ultimate pleasure as being connected completely to Hashem. And if that isn't the case, then what stops us then even once Mashiach comes and we once again connect to the truth of Hashem, will we again get lost in these kinds of off the mark pursuit of pleasures?
So the short answer is I don't know. The short answer is I don't know. but I'm just going to try to think about this for a minute. Is as follows. The problem with the true pleasure, the pleasure of oneness, is that it's more abstract, and we have other parts of our consciousness that don't appreciate that pleasure, right? If I'm hungry and you tell me, we're going to go and study philosophy, and that's where you should get your pleasure. Part of us doesn't understand it. Part of us wants to eat sweet foods. That's where we get pleasure. So part of our soul gets pleasure from more spiritual things. That is like music or art or knowledge or spirituality, but that's the more elevated side of self. But we do have a more animalistic side that really is not affected by that. And it takes work to really shift our attention from the pleasures of the body to the pleasures of the soul. And that's what I mentioned, that it's hard to do. It's not natural. Naturally, everybody likes sweets. Not everybody likes classical music, right? It takes work to be able to elevate yourself to understand the more abstract pleasures. So the reason why not everybody why we're searching elsewhere, why we're following those other rivers, is because part of us, that knowledge, that awareness and spiritual pleasure is too abstract. Part of us it doesn't speak to, right? We have the animal within us that pleasure does not satisfy. And therefore, we are following what the animal wants. And of course, the challenge of the person is to understand that there are different forms of pleasure in this world. And you should seek more to explore the spiritual pleasures than the physical pleasures. I'm not even talking about God, but I'm talking about even in the more physical realm. I should be a person that likes more elevated forms of pleasure, for example, music or art or wisdom over food, firstly because it's healthier, but really because it's more pleasurable. It's actually more enjoyable.
Rabbi?
And therefore, when you eat a bar of chocolate, at the end you suffer. Doesn't feel good. In other words, it's fleeting. But when you engage in a pleasure that's more refined, it's actually more pleasurable. If you can tune into it, it's actually more pleasurable. If you can develop a taste for it. But still, part of us is not going to relate to it, and therefore people are running outside of the garden. Therefore, Adam and Eve themselves are being pulled out of the garden. So we'll talk about how that happens. But at the end of the day, it all boils down to the fact that we are a hybrid. We are Adam, we're from Adamah, we're from the earth, and we have a spirit of God within us. So like King Solomon says, the spirit of man goes up, the spirit of the animal goes down, right? Depending where are we going. Two parts of ourselves are pulling us in two different directions. And that's why we're leaving the Garden of Eden and we're walking down one or all or some of the other paths as well, the other rivers, the other highways.
Okay, Rabbi?
Yes.
Okay. It's just, I think in past readings, it's the nature of the oneness in the Garden of Eden is different from the nature of the oneness after you've dealt with all those other rivers.
Correct. Yeah, we'll have to tackle the story of the Garden of Eden and give it its due attention. We'll get to that. But yes, there's a certain innocence and a certain purity that transcends the world. That's the highest world. And then there's the creation, and creation is separation, and fragmentation. But ultimately, the purpose of fragmentation is that we recreate the oneness. Ultimately, the purpose of this universe is to be a Garden of Eden, to be a place of pleasure where we get pleasure from the spiritual connection to God. So ultimately, the fragmentation is not the goal. The fragmentation is that we then create the unity out of the fragmentation, and that becomes a little bit more, and that becomes actually more enduring. That's to Amy's point. It's more enduring and maybe even more pleasurable.
Rabbi, that original state of oneness is compared to infancy. So it's undifferentiated. It's almost close to the angels. So it's not the most desirable. And what comes later, after you've gone through everything, is that second stage of knowing. So it's really different from that original one.
I agree. It's different and it's more complex, and I agree, but this is a big subject, so we have to explore it. We'll explore it in the next few weeks, but I just want to make another few points about the Garden of Eden and what true pleasure is. Verse 15. I don't want you to go home and say we read just a few. Okay, we actually read a nice amount of verses today. Okay, good. Verse 15. Hashem Elohim took the man and placed him in the Garden of Eden to work it and to preserve it. So we mentioned two things. I mentioned this verse before. The commentaries explain that this represents the fact that God did not create Adam in the garden. He took him and placed him in the garden after he was created. In other words, there's a state before he's in the garden, and then he's placed in the garden. In other words, to really enjoy the garden, you have to be born outside the garden. In other words, you have to realize and not take it for granted. You have to realize that this is a gift. And that's part of the challenge of the human condition, is that we ultimately, everything we have, we take for granted, and then we expect the gift. But as soon as we get the gift, we say, okay, that's what I deserve. Now I want more. But God is sort of addressing that by saying he wasn't created in the garden. He has consciousness outside the garden, and then he's placed in the garden, and maybe he will appreciate it. Of course, it didn't work. Man didn't appreciate it, and therefore man found himself outside the garden, but that's for later. Now, why did he place him in the garden? To work it and to preserve it. So the question is, what is he working and what's he preserving? So one interpretation would be, well, you have to work the garden, you have to water the garden, and then you have to also preserve it, make sure the animals don't get in. Okay, fine. Problem with that interpretation is that it's not a vegetable garden. It's really an orchard. It's not really a garden. It's an orchard, and there are trees. An orchard does not take that much work, really, because the trees grow, and it's not like growing produce, which takes a lot of work. And also the gardening, it's trees. It's much easier to guard. It's not that much work. So it's interesting that he places them in a garden, and he says, "You here have a mission to work it and to guard it." So there are a few ways of reading this verse. The first thing is that pleasure cannot be separated from responsibility. This is an interesting point. We would explain, so what's bliss? You put the person in the Garden of Eden, you help him understand that he can tap into the feeling of the oneness of God, and that's pleasure. Okay, wonderful. Life is good. So in other words, if you want to give someone a pleasurable existence, give them all the fruits and vegetables, all the delicious fruits you can find in the Whole Foods, and let them sit on the beach chair with their feet up and enjoy the beautiful fruits. That's what Garden of Eden is. But that's not what God says. God places Adam in the garden, and he gives him a responsibility. In other words, you have to work it and you have to protect it. In other words, there's a deep psychological need. A person needs to feel that their existence has purpose and they're accomplishing something. A person cannot just sit in a place of paradise and expect to just receive pleasure. That is not pleasurable. So it's interesting that tied into the concept of pleasure is, I need to find what is my calling, what is my purpose, what am I giving to the garden, not just what the garden is giving to me. So this is fascinating. We tend to think of work as I have to work because I have a need. But if all my needs were met, then I wouldn't have to work. Again, work doesn't just mean going to work and getting a paycheck. But work means I have to produce. I have to exert effort. So typically we think of work as work is a necessity created because there is some sort of insufficiency. But the truth is, what this verse is telling us, paradise requires pleasure. The pleasure of paradise requires that you should understand that your existence has meaning and has purpose. Because if you don't have a purpose, if there's nothing that you're needed for, you're not really in paradise. You're not experiencing pleasure. So that's a very deep concept, and that's something that a psychological concept we can talk about. We have a minute or two left, so I want to just add a few details about this. Others say that la'avdal l'shamra, to work it and to guard it represents not just necessarily the physical labor of protecting the garden, because that again is not necessarily labor intensive. We're talking about trees, not vegetables, not grain. And who's he guarding it from? He's guarding it from a thief. There are no thieves, right? What is he guarding exactly? So therefore people say that la'avdal l'shamra, the Medrash says, la'avdal l'shamra, to work it and to guard it. To work it represents the positive mitzvah, and to guard it means the negative mitzvah. In other words, we're talking about not necessarily physical work, but spiritual work. And in the Garden of Eden, Adam has both. He has the positive mitzvah and the negative mitzvah. The positive mitzvah is to eat of the trees. If you look at verse 16 and 17, you have spelled out the positive mitzvah and the negative mitzvah. It's not you may eat of the trees. Vayitzav, Hashem Elohim commanded the man. Commanded is the word tzav, mitzvah. He commanded the man saying, you may certainly eat from every tree in the garden. Bad translation. It could indeed mean you may certainly eat, but it can also mean mikol eitz hagan, of all the fruit of all the trees of the garden, achol tochel, you shall eat. And not just you shall, but double. This could be a commandment to eat. Okay? And then in verse 17, but from the tree of knowledge of what is good and evil, you shall not eat from it. For on the day you eat from it, you will certainly die. So this rings true according to the interpretation of the Talmud, that the Avdal L'Shamra in 15, God places man in the Garden of Eden to work it and to preserve it. Preserve means to guard. What am I guarding against? Preserve it means do a positive mitzvah, and meaning do what God says, and to preserve is that's to work it, and to preserve is to make sure that you don't go against God's will, and that's the next two verses. 16 is to work it, 17 is to preserve it. What we're really saying is that in Eden, man, the pleasure that man derives in Eden is tied into his mission. His mission could mean physically taking care of, attending to the garden, but it can also mean spiritually. In other words, fulfilling God's commandment, the fact that the human being has a moral mission. This you should do, this you shall not do. Animals don't have that. A human being has that. That moral responsibility, that moral mission is what gives the person purpose, and that mission is what is the ultimate pleasure. So the ultimate pleasure, we mentioned before, a person has a psychological need to feel that he has purpose. What is that purpose? So it could mean the physical interpretation is the physical tending to the garden. It can also mean the spiritual tending to the garden, which means fulfilling God's will and not going against God's will. And that is the purpose and the benefit that we derive, and this pleasure we derive from having this purpose. Just one more interpretation. I think the Or HaChaim says this, basically sandwiches the two. In the physical world that we live in today, there's a disconnect between the spiritual and the physical. And therefore, I could be healthy spiritually and unhealthy physically. That could happen because the flow from the spiritual to the physical is a little bit out of sync. But in the perfect world, a healthy spiritual person would also be a healthy physically person. Like the Shema says, if you follow God's commandment, it's going to rain. If you don't follow God's commandment, it's not going to rain. We don't see that in our world today because we're in exile. So the divine flow is not as obvious to us. And the world we're living in today, there's a sort of a separation between the physical and the spiritual. But in the Garden of in Israel, in the times of the temple, but certainly in the Garden of Eden, if you did not feel God's commandment, that would have a physical toll on the fruit. So remember, we had two interpretations. One interpretation is to work the land and to guard and to preserve the land is taking care of the fruit. The other interpretation is it's to follow God's commandments. Comes the Or HaChaim and connects the two. It's one and the same. How do you take care of the physical garden in the world of Eden? In the world of Eden, when the spiritual and the physical are in sync, how do you preserve the physical fruits? The way you preserve it is by keeping God's will, because God's will was the conduit for the physical blessing as well, unlike it is in this world. So we have three interpretations. One, to work it is physical. One, to work it is spiritual. And the third one is that both of those interpretations are one and the same. And just to finish with this point, where is the Garden of Eden today? If you go to the Middle East, you're not going to find it. Some people say it was just allegory, it's just a metaphor. Other people say, no, there was a garden, but what happened? The garden fell apart. Why did the garden fall apart? No one took care of it. So if you follow this interpretation, it makes a lot of sense. Because once people stopped keeping God's commandment regarding the garden, the garden's going to fall apart. That's what we just finished saying, according to the third interpretation. In the pre-Eden world, the Eden represents the physical world, the way it's at sync with the spiritual world. So if you follow God's commandment, you get the blessing. If you don't, the garden falls apart. So those are the three interpretations of what does it mean to work it and to guard it. So just to summarize what we discussed today, the four highways, the one pleasure, how the one pleasure fragments into four different highways, the four ways where people leave the garden and seek to pursue pleasure. The good news about the river, by the way, and we'll have to conclude something positive, is the whole point of the river is you can flow outward, but you can also flow inward. You're traveling away, but it's a highway. A highway has two ways. It's two-way streets. So in some sense, we can also trace our way back. That seeking pleasure is actually something that can actually bring you closer to God. Because ultimately, if you seek pleasure and you trace the roots of why I want pleasure, ultimately what you want that sense of oneness. You think you get it through money. You think you get it through passion. You think you get it from honor, but it doesn't work. Ultimately, you're going to have to trace your way back and come back to Eden and find a true pleasure, which is the pleasure and the oneness of God. This,
Rabbi,
ladies and gentlemen, is the story in short. Go ahead.
Rabbi, does it mean that maybe there is a way to connect to the spiritual